In this lecture, we're going to look at types of legislative and executive systems. And when I say we're going to look at, I'm going to walk you through a basic schema of how it is that legislative and executive systems can be set up in a democratic system. Now, there are even more options than I'm going to lay out for you because almost everything that I'm going to show you can be hybridized in some kind of way. So I may note those along the way, but in order to keep the diagram from being too terribly complex, I'm really going to stick to kind of major types of systems and the major variants so that it's not crazy. And I'll probably note along the way where different things can be done. So the legislative and executive systems are an important part, though not a comprehensive part, of the entire policymaking process. The policymaking power of the government in a democratic system comes from the people. And so the people are sort of always there. Now, I use a little cloud here because the people are sort of this amorphous blob-like thing, which is misty around the edges and hard to define. So that's part of the reason for the choice of that particular image. But the people are always there. And that's one of the things to remember in a democratic system is that whatever the selection mechanisms are, however many steps a process is, or however remote the linkages happen to be, they are all in a democratic system connected to the people. One of the things to think about as we consider the variety of institutions and arrangements that can be set up is, do certain arrangements get too distant from the people? Are some arrangements too close to the people? What's like a really good, obviously there's no optimal distance, but what's a really good range of space between the people's ultimate power and the office holders occupying institutions who are going to be the ones who are driving the decisions that are made in the policymaking process. Okay, so the foundational power is in the legislature. All things start with the legislature, and that's because the legislature is generally the closest to the people, or at least it is the expression of the most direct expression of the people's will through representatives. Now, what can a legislature look like? There are two basic designs, and again, there could be multiple ones, but there are two basic versions of a legislature. A unicameral legislature where there's one single body and all policies have to pass with a majority, or in some cases a supermajority of one single body. So imagine that we have a simple nation of 10 million people and there's a unicameral legislature of 100 representatives. The other option that is very familiar and is pretty much the dominant one in the universe of democratic governments in the the world is the bicameral legislature. Just because it's the dominant one doesn't necessarily mean it's necessarily the correct one. It's just more common, and one of the reasons it's more common is because the foundational legislative systems in the modern era were bicameral. The Parliament, the British Parliament, and the U.S. Congress, and of course, actually many of the, if not, but not all of the state legislatures were bicameral. I believe we have two unicameral legislatures in the United States. It might be three, and I don't know exactly which ones they are, but it's pretty uncommon, and it's relatively rare in the rest of the world for there to be unicameral legislatures. Now, I have an asterisk here that says mixed representation is possible, and I'll talk a little bit about how mixed representation would look when we get into selection mechanisms connecting the people to the legislature. I should note that mixed representation is theoretically possible in a unicameral legislature. You can have 100 representatives, 50 of whom are chosen through one type of mechanism and 50 of whom are chosen through another type of mechanism, or 60-40, or whatever kind of mix you want. This is the sort of hybridization that I've talked about. That doesn't really exist much, if at all, in the world, and it's extremely rare. It doesn't mean it's not possible, and it doesn't mean there aren't actually good reasons for doing it that way and that it's not beneficial. It's just that in a bicameral legislature, because you have two houses, you can have one house have one type of representation and the other house have another type of representation. The U.S. Congress is set up this way. Almost every state legislature that's bicameral is set up this way. We have a 2-year election cycle for the House House of Representatives with people representing smaller, typically more homogeneous territorial districts of about 850,000 people. And then we have the Senate, which is 6-year terms made up of people representing entire states. And of course, states range from Wyoming through California in terms of size. So those are two different types of representation. They are both winner-take-all district-based systems. But that is a form of low-grade mixed representation. Okay, before I get further in, I'm just going to go to the next arrow here. How do we connect the people to the legislature? What is it that takes the people and fills the legislature? It's elections, and that's what that big red arrow indicates. An election is what takes the entire body of the people and selects the number of offices in the legislature down to put into that position of power. Now, there are a couple of questions here in the pink box. What's the length of the election cycle? Do they have concurrent or staggered terms? Are there term limits? There are other electoral questions that get answered, such as what's the time of the election? Is it 1 day? Is it 2 weeks? Is there absentee ballots? What are the restrictions? What are the requirements? We've gone over that in module 1, and I just want to note that there are a lot of other questions, but these 3 particular questions are definitely related to taking the people and putting them into a smaller group, distilling down the whole voice of the people into a set of representatives that exercise this foundational policy-making power. The length of the election cycle is really important because that's the duration that representatives have to be free from direct control of the people. If you have a 2-year election cycle, you have 2 years to exercise policy-making power before you have to re-up for another 2 years of that. That's a very different thing than if you have 6 years. Again, if there are concurrent or staggered terms, then the turnover in the legislature is different. If you have concurrent terms, if you have a unicameral legislature where everybody's reelected every 2 years, that means you have the entire body of the legislature can be transformed. If you have staggered terms, then the design can limit the turnover to some fraction. Let's say you have 4-year terms and 25 of the 100 members of the unicameral legislature are reelected every 1 year. So the people get to vote every year, but the people only get to replace 1/4 of the legislature. Every 4 years, 100% of the legislature gets turned over. That's a very different style of legislative system than when you have say a 4-year concurrent cycle. And then obviously term limits are really big because term limits sort of speak to the issue of political equality or political inequality. When there are term limits, there's only a certain amount of time that individual people from the people can rise out of this cloud and exercise this foundational policy-making power. It's obviously a big structure or a big part of the legislative system. Term-limited legislatures look very different than non-term limited legislatures, just like legislatures with a staggered membership look very different than a legislature with a concurrent membership. At the federal level in the United States, we have a bicameral legislature with one house. The House of Representatives has concurrent short-term election cycles with no term limits. Members of the House of Representatives serve 2-year terms. All 435 get reelected every 2 years. There's a theoretical possibility to change that 435 members for a completely different 435 members. That it doesn't really happen in practice, but the fact that everybody's up for re-election means that the majority in the House of Representatives is really up for grabs every single time. The Senate has a 6-year election cycle with staggered terms. Only 1/3 of senators are reelected every 2 years. So the majority in the Senate is much slower to change. Now, with 1/3 of seats up, unless one party has a really, really strong majority, the majority is theoretically up for grabs in every 2-year cycle. But when you only have 1/3 of senators up for re-election, it becomes harder to change the majority in one cycle. And of course, some cycles are different than others. In the upcoming 2022 Senate cycle, with the 32 seats that are up for grabs, the 33 seats that are up for grabs, there are 21 Republican seats and only 12 Democratic seats. That's going to mean that there's a greater chance for the Democratic Party to expand its majority than for the Republican Party to gain a majority back. So that's one of the things that happens with either concurrent or staggered terms. And in neither case do we have term limits. And so you can get people who are 36, 42 years in the Senate, which is actually something that has happened. Okay, the other arrow here, or the other tag here is on the arrow, and this is the kind of elections: district-based or proportional. Now, you'll probably recall from one or more of the lectures from Module 1 that there's more variety in electoral types, and I just wanted to boil it down to these two types because this basic choice gives us a different flavor for the kind of legislative system that we have. When you have district-based legislative seating, what you're going to get in your representation is you're going to get representatives who represent a territorially distinct constituency, people in a place. And when you're a district-based representative, those people are your constituents. Now, they're your constituents whether they voted for you or not. And in theory, you're supposed to be expressing everybody's voice. But in reality, and I discussed this in Module 1 and in a few of the Q&A sessions, in reality, the kind of political calculation that you're going to be making if you're a district-based representative is going to be about the key constituency that's going to keep you getting elected. And so in theory, you're supposed to be representing the voice of everybody, but in reality, you're going to be paying the most attention to the group of people that could keep you in office or keep you out of office, and that is far from the majority or of your actual constituency. In a proportional system, you are electing the entire body of the legislature in an at-large fashion based on proportion of party vote. So when you're a representative in a proportional system, you have a constituency, but your constituency is really an ideological one, and it's easier to represent the voice of all of your constituents because your constituents are not the people who live in a place. Your constituents are the people who voted for you. In a district-based system, your constituents are everybody who lives in a place, whether they voted for you or not. Again, you're paying attention to the key constituency that keeps you getting elected. When you are elected in a proportional system, you are a representative of a party whose interest it is to represent all of the voters who voted for that party. Now, part of your political calculation is always going to be, how do we keep those same voters voting for us in the future, and how do we, if possible, expand that voting base? So there's a sense in which you're going to be looking at key constituencies in your own ideological group, people who might shear off. Like, you know, if you're part of the Democratic Party and there are Green Party representatives, the Democratic Party is going to have to worry that some percentage of its constituency is going to leave the Democratic Party next election for the Green Party, and vice versa. Greens have to worry that some of their people might peel off and become Democrats. But in general, you're really going to be representing the entirety of your constituency, and your constituency is an ideological constituency. It's a policy constituency as opposed to a territorial constituency. This is a really foundational choice because it matters a lot how the legislature functions depending on which of these particular choices you make. And comparative democratic politics bears out that the type of legislative deal-making, maneuvering, policy-making that goes on in a system with proportional representation looks quite different from that which is based on a district-based system. One of the biggest differences is that usually in a district-based system, there will be a two-party system, because with winner-take-all, the incentive is to build a party coalition before the election so you can get the most votes and therefore get the largest number of seats. In a two-party system, your goal as a party is to get legislative majorities so that you can control the legislative agenda. In a proportional system, typically there are multiple parties because different parties can win a percentage of the vote that's higher or lower based on how well they appeal to a specific ideological constituency. And there's no built-in incentive to try to make your tent as big as possible. There's no built-in incentive to build a pre-election coalition. The incentives are to build a post-election or legislative or parliamentary coalition between two or more parties that are like-minded enough, their Venn diagram of policies overlaps enough that they can sort of form a coalition type government. In a proportional system, we get coalition governments made up of multiple parties. In a district-based system, we get coalition parties made up of distinct ideological constituencies seeking to get a pre-election majority. So this choice really makes a big difference in how the legislature functions and what it looks like. Now, the mixed representation that's possible is actually one that's used, and it's very compelling. In a bicameral legislature, you have one house that's represented, that represents districts, territorial, elected that way, and the other house is proportionally elected. And what that enables is the representatives of the people to do both things, to represent a territory and a specific set of people who live in a place, and that's an important form of representation. It also allows the legislature to represent a set of ideas, ideologies, policy agendas through the system of proportional representation. Now, one of the things about choosing a bicameral legislature over a unicameral legislature is that it makes that mixed representation possible, but it also creates an obstacle to policymaking, because when you have a bicameral legislature, you're choosing to give two separate bodies the not identical power, but shared power. They have to agree on every policy for that policy to move forward. And that is a more complex endeavor than a single body, a unicameral legislature, making policy. If you have a 100-member unicameral legislature, you need 51 votes to move a policy. And those 51 votes all come from the same body, the same people elected through the same mechanism. In a bicameral legislature, you need 50% plus one in two different groups. And if you have different types of representation, it's going to be tricky to get that majority in both of those groups. This is one of the reasons why the US Congress is actually quite obstacle-ridden, is because we have a bicameral legislature, and even though both of those legislatures are district-based, winner-take-all elected, so they have similarities in their view on political maneuvering and political calculations, and we have a two-party system in both, because there's a 2-year election cycle in the House that's concurrent and a 6-year election cycle that's staggered, and because they represent different sized constituencies, it's likely and often happens that the senators and House members don't see policy the same way, even when the same party controls the majority in both houses, because members of the House of Representatives and members of the Senate, even from the same party, don't always see policy the same way because of their different election mechanism. Imagine if you then also had, instead of two houses elected district-based, you had one house that was elected district-based and then that was elected proportionally. Those members would be seeing things very differently. So choosing a bicameral legislature is automatically a choice that creates a greater obstacle to exercising this foundational policymaking power. And of course, that's actually one of the arrangements that creates a restraint on this foundational policymaking power. And this is often why it's seen to be a particularly good thing to use, because it holds back the legislature from acting too precipitously, too rapidly. Okay, that is sort of the basic layout of what types of choices go into creating a legislative system and some of the consequences of those choices. Let's look now at executive systems. Executives implement policy and they exercise some amount of regulatory power. And I'll talk about regulatory power in the next lecture. So we can just leave that aside for right now. There are two basic types of executive systems. There's the parliamentary system, where the chief executive is a prime minister. And there's the presidential system, where the chief executive is a president. That's where the name comes from. Now, what's the difference in how these systems work? It's really fundamentally about who chooses the chief executive. For the parliamentary system, the chief executive is chosen by the legislature. And in a presidential system, the president is chosen either by the people directly or through some kind of optional mediating entity, which is what we have in the United States with the Electoral College. You could have a direct elected presidential system. This is what most countries that have presidential systems or mixed systems do, is the president is directly elected through a majority national popular vote. But it's possible to give the people a direct indirect choice. And that might sound like a contradictory term, direct, indirect, but it's direct because it doesn't go through the legislature, but it's indirect because it does go through some kind of mediating entity that usually exists only for that singular purpose of choosing the president. The parliamentary system, the legislature chooses the prime minister, the chief executive. Here's the main difference between these two systems. Who is the electorate that the chief executive is having to appeal to? Is it a group of politicians, which is in the parliamentary system, or is it the people, either directly or through this mediating entity? Those are two very different selection populations, and prime ministers tend to look politically very different than presidents, because presidents are people who have to appeal to regular people. Prime ministers are people who have to appeal to other politicians. What it takes to rise to the prime ministerial position is you rise through the ranks of your party and become your party leader. And you become your party leader by doing good things for and appealing to members of your party who are elected. Other members who are important, like party chairs and state committee members, but fundamentally other elected officials within your party. Lobbying, campaigning, connecting with, swaying politicians is a very different kind of activity than lobbying, campaigning, swaying the population as a whole. Or as in the case of the US presidential election, swaying the swing voters, the independent swing voters in the handful of swing states that will decide the Electoral College vote. Those are two very different things. Now, one of the reasons why we have this bizarre system that we have, and I say bizarre only because it's pretty rare. It's not actually that bizarre. It's a multi-tiered direct-indirect system, which, while that sounds complicated, democracy is full of these kinds of things, because a parliamentary system is an indirect system. It's a two-tiered indirect selection. The people vote for the legislature votes for the prime minister. But part of the reason why we have this two-tiered direct-indirect, call it bizarre if you want, electoral college system, is that the authors of the Constitution considered a parliamentary system. They considered having Congress choose the president, and they rejected that because they didn't want the chief executive to be a politician's politician. They also rejected national popular vote, partly because, one, there was no national electorate existing at the time. There was no unified nation that had a people. There were separate states, and so to then create a national electorate and a national electoral system seemed like a big task. It also was problematic because many of the authors of the Constitution didn't trust the people to make a direct choice. And really, when you're looking at which of these two executive systems to choose, it really is about which population do you trust more? Do you trust politicians to choose the chief executive, or do you choose the people to, or do you trust the people to choose the chief executive? As with everything in a democratic system, there are trade-offs to both of those, right? One of the positives of a parliamentary system is that you're essentially having experienced, practicing political activists choosing the chief executive. These are people who know what the complexity of policy is. They know what it's like to make policy. They understand the dynamics, and they understand the traits that it takes to be successful at shepherding that process through, and then at doing what the chief executive does, which is implementing policy. But what that then does is that creates a distance of the prime minister from the people that may make the prime minister less responsive to what the people want and only responsive to what the politicians want. Now, theoretically, the elected officials in the legislature are responsive to the people, but as soon as you start adding layers and filtering things, you're going to get more distant, and your consideration of the people, what the people in that cloudy miasma want, is going to get more distant. Now, that's the fundamental choice between two different types of executive systems, but there's one other big wrinkle on this, and that's the unitary or multiple executive. And I've mentioned this before in Module 1, talking about office holders, and so I'll just move through it very quickly here. A unitary executive has a chief executive and nobody else that is selected through any other mechanism but appointment. The cabinet is appointed with power dependent on the chief executive. Whether you have a unitary or multiple executive, you're also going to have a cabinet of some kind that's going to be appointed. So that green box down there with the cabinet exists whether you have a unitary or multiple executive. The difference between a unitary and multiple executive is that in a unitary system, everybody but the chief executive is appointed. In a multiple executive, the chief executive and other executive officers are independently elected and have an independent source of power, not just an independent selection mechanism, but an independent source of power. So for example, in the state of Oregon, I know I've mentioned this before, but it bears mentioning again, we have a separately elected state treasurer and secretary of state and attorney general. And those people, not only do they have a constituency that's the same as the governor's, the entire people of Oregon, they're elected separately, but their decisions are not subject to the veto power of the governor, which is not true of the legislature. The legislature's decisions can be vetoed by the governor. The choices of the secretary of state cannot be vetoed by the governor. And so they have an independent source, not just an independent election, but an independent source of power. The unitary executive was the choice of the authors of our Constitution, mostly because the only versions of a multiple executive that they saw in history were kind of disastrously problematic, government by committee. There wasn't yet the experience with a multiple executive that in fact functioned in a positive way, where instead of sharing power, that's what all the historical examples of multiple executives did. The multiple executives all shared the same source of power. The idea that you could actually divide up the executive institution into different zones of control didn't occur to and didn't occur to the authors of the Constitutional Convention, and wasn't part of democratic theory at the time. Now that's not the case anymore. The most common multiple executive source globally is a dual executive, which combines the parliamentary and presidential systems and divides the power, the executive power between those two offices in a pretty clean way. Often, the prime minister is in charge of domestic policy and the president is in charge of foreign policy. That makes a lot of sense because the legislature is primarily dealing with domestic policy. And so they choose one of their own members to be the chief executive of the domestic policy entities. And then the president is elected by the people as a whole to represent how the nation as a whole interacts with other nations in the world. And so that is a very sensible arrangement. And in the countries that have it, it actually works out quite well. There are then also ways to have the prime minister and the president check each other's power with either with vetoes or with required consent from one or the other, depending on which kinds of decisions are being made. Much like the power of our president is checked in various ways. For example, the president of the United States has treaty-making power, but those treaties have to be ratified by the Senate. And so that treaty-making power, that foreign policy power, is a shared one. So a multiple executive, the simplest version is a dual executive, but multiple executives, as I've indicated at the state level, can exist as well. What is important in a multiple executive is to essentially divide up power among different executive office holders, rather than essentially making it an executive by committee. Now, that is a theoretical possibility, the executive by committee, and that is one of the examples from Roman history that the authors of the Constitution were aware of and looked at and rejected. The idea of a triumvirate, the three different people who share the same executive power, that is problematic because it really does clearly create a kind of infighting and a power struggle that is destructive. You don't necessarily even need a knowledge of Roman history to understand why an executive committee would be problematic for efficient and effective executive action. But the idea of the multiple executive isn't executive by committee, it's executive by divided power, separated power instead of shared power. And then, of course, you can, if you want, build in checks and balances into the executive itself. You can say, for example, if the president has the power to negotiate treaties with other countries, you can set it up so that the prime minister has to approve of the treaty. And if the prime minister doesn't approve of the treaty, then the president can appeal to, say, the legislature for approval. Or can set it for a national referendum. That's a way of creating a check on the president's foreign policy power that is also not just a total obstacle. Now, I will end this lecture by pointing out that one of the things about how you arrange these systems in relation to each other, and this will be the subject of the next lecture about separated, shared, and blended powers, is that paying attention to the kinds of political dynamics that will occur when you create certain kinds of arrangements versus different kinds of arrangements is an important analytical and evaluation tool. If we're considering that we want to have a dual executive, we want to have a prime minister dealing with domestic policy and a president dealing with foreign policy, but we want to check the foreign policy power of the president, we're going to then place the ratification in the hands of somebody. Now, the question is who, right? Do we want to place it in the hands of the prime minister, which is just one person? So the president is now having to think about what's the prime minister going to think of this treaty? Or do you want to put the ratification power in the hands of the legislature as a whole? So the president then has to be thinking, well, how can I get a legislative majority to approve of this treaty? That's a very different kind of thinking. I'm thinking about one person approving it, or I'm thinking about a majority of an elected body approving it. Those are the kinds of dynamics that need to get paid attention to when designing legislative and executive systems, and when designing, in fact, the entire institutional arrangement of a democratic society. Okay, more about that in the next lecture.